When I was 19 years old, my grandmother pulled me into her kitchen on a Tuesday morning and pressed a single piece of paper into my hands. "This is for your future," she whispered, kissing my forehead. "Don't tell anyone it exists. Not yet." I didn't ask questions. I tucked it away in a manila folder that stayed hidden for the next 17 years. My name is Elise Moreau. I'm 36 years old, and I'm finally able to tell you what happened after my parents spent every dollar of that inheritance on my sister's life, and how I quietly dismantled their financial world with nothing but documentation and one phone call. It started in March of 2019, though I didn't know it at the time. I was living in Chicago then, working as a financial analyst for a commercial real estate firm. My job was to follow money trails, to see patterns that most people missed, to ask the questions that made uncomfortable truths visible. It was good training for what was about to happen to my own life. My mother called me on a Wednesday evening. I remember the exact time because I was leaving the office, 5:47 p.m. on March 13th, and my phone lit up with her name. "Elise, we need to talk about your trust fund," she said, her voice almost apologetic. I felt something shift inside my chest. I didn't say anything. I just waited for her to continue. She explained it carefully, almost gently. My grandmother's inheritance, the one she'd left specifically for me, documented in a will dated 1987, had been consolidated for tax purposes into the family account. Most of it had gone to pay for Monica's lifestyle. My sister Monica, 2 years younger than me, who'd never worked a day in her adult life. My parents had covered her apartment in Manhattan, her car payments, her shopping habits, her trips to Europe, her failed business ventures, all of it. For over 16 years, they'd simply decided my inheritance was the family's money to manage, and they'd managed it directly into my sister's bank account. I could hear my mother breathing on the other end of the line, waiting for me to react. I didn't. I simply said, "Thank you for telling me," and hung up. Before I continue, if this story is starting to resonate with you, take a moment to subscribe, but only if you genuinely feel something. And if you're listening from somewhere specific right now, drop a comment telling me your city and what time it is where you are. I love knowing who's on the other side of the screen. Now let me take you back to where this really began. My grandmother's name was Eleanor Robbins. She passed away in October of 2001, when I was 12 years old. She'd been a contract lawyer, brilliant and careful, meticulous about detail. She'd drafted her own will without anyone else in the room. My mother didn't know exactly what was in it, though she'd asked 1,000 times. What I understood, even at 12, was that Grandma Eleanor had loved me in a specific way. She'd taught me how to read documents, how to question numbers, how to spot when something didn't add up. In the kitchen that morning when I was 19, she'd handed me the original copy of my trust fund paperwork. $312,000, held in the Eleanor Robbins Family Trust, for Elise Catherine Moreau, upon reaching the age of 25. That was 2008. My 25th birthday passed, and the money never appeared. I was busy with college, with moving, with starting my first job. I didn't push. I thought it was tied up in probate. I was patient. My father was a different kind of man from Eleanor. Robert Moreau was charming and vague with money. He owned an import business that did well enough, but he'd never been the financial architect of our family. My mother was. Patricia Moreau had opinions about everything and the voice to deliver them. She'd always preferred Monica. This wasn't cruelty exactly. It was just the way certain families work. Monica was prettier, softer, more traditionally feminine. Monica needed protection. I was independent even as a child, and independence was interpreted as not needing anything. By the time I was 26, I'd stopped asking about the inheritance. I had my salary. I was building my own life. I let it go. But in that moment on the phone with my mother, something else woke up inside me. The financial analyst part of my brain didn't let go of mysteries. I hung up with my mother and immediately opened my laptop, If there had been consolidation, there would be paperwork. If the money had been transferred, there would be a trail. I spent the next 72 hours pulling records. My original trust documentation, probate filings, tax returns from the years 2001 through 2019. What I found made my hands shake. The trust had never been consolidated. The consolidation was a lie. The money had been systematically withdrawn by my mother in increments, using a power of attorney she'd executed without my knowledge or signature, starting in 2004. Over 15 years, she'd moved $301,847 in trust funds into her personal account, and from there, directly to Monica. It was all there, every transaction, every date, every amount. I didn't cry that night. I made a different decision. I printed everything, 473 pages of documentation. I labeled it. I created a timeline. And then I did something my family didn't know I'd been trained to recognize. I saw a crime. Not a gray area. Not a family misunderstanding. A federal crime. Misuse of a fiduciary power of attorney is fraud. Unauthorized access to a trust fund is theft. Filing false tax documentation to hide asset transfers is evasion. My mother had filed joint tax returns with my father during the years she was moving that money. The documents showed legitimate withdrawals from a fictitious consolidation that never actually happened. That was tax evasion. That was my opening. If you've ever been betrayed by someone who was supposed to protect you, someone who used your trust as a weapon, type "I understand" in the comments. I read every single one. I need you to know that what I'm about to tell you isn't about revenge. It's about what happens when you document the truth so carefully that the truth becomes impossible to deny. I didn't consult a lawyer. I didn't call my parents. I didn't tell my sister. I did what I'd been trained to do professionally. I followed the money. I contacted the IRS Criminal Investigation Division in Chicago on April 2, 2019, at 11:34 a.m. via their federal tax crime hotline. I had a case number within 3 hours. I submitted all 473 pages as supplementary documentation to a Form 3949-A. Everything was there. The unauthorized power of attorney, the fake consolidation paperwork, the systematic transfers, the false tax returns. The investigator assigned to the case was a man named Thomas Webb, and he called me back 5 days later to confirm they were opening a formal investigation. During those 5 days, I told no one. I went to work. I reviewed spreadsheets. I went home to my apartment in Chicago and made coffee the way my grandmother had taught me. I watched the city lights reflect off Lake Michigan. I was calm in a way that scared me a little, because I understood what I'd set in motion. Federal investigation into tax evasion is not small. It's not something that goes away quietly. It's not something that gets resolved with a family apology and a check mailed in the mail. I'd picked up the phone and invited the government into the private financial world of my family. Once that invitation goes out, it doesn't get rescinded. My mother called on May 15th. She was crying. The IRS had contacted them about an ongoing investigation regarding tax filings from 2004 to 2018. They were requesting all original documentation. They were talking about penalties. They were using words like fraud and evasion. She begged me, even before she asked directly, "Elise, please tell me it wasn't you." And I said something I'd practiced in my head 1,000 times. The documents told the story. I just made sure someone listened. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. I could hear her breathing. I could hear her understanding in real time that there was no lying out of this. There was no explaining this. There was no family meeting that could undo the federal government's interest in what she'd done. 6 months later, on November 12, 2019, at 2:15 p.m., my mother and father met with a tax attorney in their hometown of Boston. My mother had wanted me there. My father insisted I be there. I sat across from them in a conference room with mahogany walls and winter light coming through the tall windows. And I listened to an attorney explain that the federal investigation had evidence of systematic fraud spanning 14 years. The penalty alone would be $147,000, plus the full amount of misappropriated funds, plus interest, plus potential criminal charges if they chose to prosecute. My mother's hands were trembling. My father kept clearing his throat. The attorney looked at me once, just for a second, and I saw him understand that I was the source. I was the one who turned them in. And I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I simply held his gaze until he looked back to my parents. The color had drained from my father's face. My mother was crying silently, tears running down her cheeks without any sound. Monica wasn't there. She'd been cut off from the account 3 weeks earlier when the IRS frozen all assets pending investigation. She was working her first job in 7 years and terrified. What nobody knew was that I had something else. In 2008, the year I was supposed to receive my inheritance, my grandmother's old lawyer had sent me a letter. In that letter, she'd enclosed a second document, a codicil to Eleanor's will, dated just 2 weeks before her death, which stated that if any portion of my inheritance was ever misused or diverted without my explicit written consent, the entire remainder of her estate, a secondary trust of $456,000, was to be transferred directly to me, bypassing my parents entirely. Eleanor had been meticulous. She'd anticipated exactly this possibility. In one of my conversations with Thomas Webb from the IRS, I'd submitted this document as well. It proved premeditation. It proved that my grandmother had suspected my mother's financial decisions all along. I need to pause here for a second. If you can feel what I was feeling in that moment, that calm certainty you get when you stop hoping for someone to do the right thing and instead just ensure that the truth finds light, type "I see it" in the comments. I'm watching. 3 days after the attorney meeting, my mother called and asked if we could meet. Just the two of us. We met at a cafe near my office in Chicago on a gray November afternoon. She was smaller than I remembered her being. She ordered tea but didn't drink it. She looked at me for a long time before she spoke. "I thought you needed help," she said. "I thought you were like me, and you needed protecting." And I said something that I'd thought about for months. "I never needed you to protect me, Mom. I needed you to not steal from me. There's a difference." She started to cry. Not the quiet tears from the attorney's office. Loud, gasping sobs. People were looking. She didn't seem to notice or care. She told me that the secondary trust, the one Eleanor had hidden, was the thing that had broken her. The realization that her own mother had anticipated this moment. That Eleanor had drafted a document expecting Patricia to fail me. That our grandmother's lack of faith in her had been documented in legal terms and executed with precision. "Your grandmother didn't trust me," my mother said, and it was the truest thing she'd ever said to me. By January of 2020, the federal investigation concluded with my parents signing a payment agreement for the full amount owed, $447,000 in restitution, penalties, and interest. The criminal charges were dropped in exchange for immediate payment and a 5-year monitored probation period. My mother sold the house in Boston. My father dissolved his import business. They downsized to a small apartment in Connecticut. They used their retirement savings. They started over at an age when most people are supposed to be comfortable. Monica moved back home with them. We didn't speak for 8 months. When she finally called me in September of 2020, her voice was different. She'd been forced to understand, for the first time in her life, that nothing was free. That there were consequences to living off stolen money. That the person she'd always envied for being independent had actually been protecting herself, while my parents were taking away from her. We had coffee once. We didn't fix anything, but we acknowledged that we'd both been hurt by the same people, just in opposite ways. A year after the federal case closed, I was sitting in my apartment in Chicago on a Sunday morning, drinking coffee the way my grandmother taught me, with the light coming through the windows at exactly the right angle. I received a letter from Eleanor's secondary trust. The $456,000 had been transferred into my account in full, after all fees and taxes. I sat with that number for hours. I didn't touch it. I didn't feel victorious. I felt the weight of being the woman in my family who had to be the one to hold people accountable. But I also felt something else. I felt safe. I felt like my grandmother was still protecting me, even from beyond whatever she'd understood about my mother's nature all along. My parents and I don't have the relationship we did before. Some things don't repair, they just scar over. But on a Tuesday in March, almost 2 years later, my mother sent me an email. It had one line: "I hope Eleanor is proud of what you became." I didn't respond for a week. When I did, I wrote back, "I think she always knew I would be." Because that's what I've learned through all of this. Some of the greatest gifts we receive are the ones that teach us how to protect ourselves. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments what you felt when you realized the truth was documented. If you know someone who needs to hear today that their independence is their power, share this with them. And if you're new here, subscribe. Another story is waiting in the description, and there's nothing quite like hearing the truth told by someone who knows its weight. Thank you for being here all the way to the end. I'll see you very soon.